A woman called me 2 winters back, badly shaken. She had gone out at first light and found feathers scattered across half her run. No bird in sight, no obvious trail, nothing that told her what had actually happened during the night. She assumed the worst kind of attack and spent the whole day convinced her flock would never be safe again in that spot. What she was actually looking at, once I walked her through it over the phone, was a fairly classic sign of a hawk strike. Feathers pulled and scattered in a rough circle. No carcass, no digging, nothing disturbed at ground level. That is a very different problem with a very different fix than what she had spent the whole morning assuming. This is exactly why reading the scene properly matters. Every predator that comes through a coop leaves its own particular signature behind, and getting that signature right tells you exactly where to put your effort next, rather than guessing and fixing the wrong thing while the actual gap stays wide open. Here is the mechanism worth understanding before the list itself. Predators are creatures of habit, built by millions of years to hunt in the specific way their body and their circumstances allow. A hawk cannot dig. A raccoon cannot fly. A fox behaves completely differently from a possum passing through by chance. Read the pattern correctly, and you are not just identifying what happened once. You are identifying exactly what to guard against happening again. Most keepers, understandably, panic first and investigate second, if they investigate at all. That panic is exactly what leads to the wrong fix. A keeper, convinced a fox is responsible, will spend money reinforcing a fence line, while a hawk keeps striking from an uncovered run above, because the actual gap was never in the fence to begin with. 5 extra minutes reading the scene properly before reaching for any tool or any fix saves both money and repeated losses down the line. I want to be plain about something before the list itself begins. None of this is about assigning blame to the animal doing what its own nature built it to do. A hawk hunting is not doing anything wrong by its own instincts. The responsibility sits entirely with the setup around the flock, and every single fix on this list is well within reach of an ordinary keeper on an ordinary budget. Number 1, feathers scattered in a loose circle with no bird and no digging anywhere nearby. This pattern points to an aerial predator, most commonly a hawk or an owl, depending on whether the loss happened during the day or overnight. These birds strike from above, take their catch a short distance away to feed, and leave behind a scatter of feathers at both the strike point and the feeding point a little further off. The fix here is entirely about covering the run from above. A hawk needs open sky and a clear approach to work, so netting or wire across the top of any uncovered run removes the opportunity completely. Daytime strikes point to hawks specifically, while a loss that happens well after dark with this same feather pattern usually points to a great horned owl instead, which hunts on a completely different schedule. A roll of poultry netting to cover a modest run typically costs somewhere between $30 and $60 and installs in an afternoon. That is a genuinely small cost against the alternative of losing birds to open sky one at a time, season after season, without ever addressing the actual gap. Timing tells you more than the feathers alone. A daytime strike almost always means a hawk. Since owls are overwhelmingly nocturnal hunters and rarely active while the sun is up, if your flock free ranges during the day without any overhead cover at all, a hawk strike in open country can happen in broad daylight within seconds, often while a keeper is standing only a short distance away and simply did not see it coming. Smaller breeds and bantams are at meaningfully higher risk from aerial predators than larger, heavier birds, simply because they are easier to lift and carry off. If you keep a mixed flock and have lost a smaller bird this way before, covering the run becomes even more worth the modest cost, since the risk is not spread evenly across every bird you own. Number 2. A bird missing entirely with digging or a disturbed patch of ground at the fence line. This is the signature of a ground-based predator working the perimeter rather than coming from above. Foxes and coyotes will dig beneath a fence that looks secure from a standing height but was never actually anchored into the ground itself. The bird is often simply gone, taken away from the site entirely rather than left behind. Check the full perimeter of your run at ground level, not just a glance from a few feet away. Look specifically for fresh, disturbed soil, a shallow depression or a gap where the wire has been pushed up rather than pulled through. Foxes in particular are patient and will test the same weak spot on multiple nights before finally getting through. Bury hardware cloth at least 6 inches into the ground along the entire run perimeter, or lay a wide skirt of it flat against the surface and pin it down securely. This single fix closes off the single most common ground level entry point in the whole hobby, and it's worth checking even on a run you consider fully secure. Foxes and coyotes typically hunt at dawn and dusk, far more than in the deep middle of the night, which is worth knowing if you are trying to narrow down when a loss most likely happened. A coyote will usually take a bird a considerable distance from the coop before feeding, while a fox more often stays closer to the point of entry. So distance from the coop itself can help narrow down which of the two you are actually dealing with on your own ground. A skirt of buried wire costs somewhere between $15 and $30 for a modest-sized run, depending on the length of your perimeter and the grade of hardware cloth you choose. Digging the trench yourself is genuinely the harder part of the job, but a weekend afternoon spent on it closes a gap that would otherwise cost you a bird at a time for years. Number 3, signs of an animal reaching directly through the wire itself. A bird found injured or unwell right against the fence line with damage concentrated at exactly that spot points strongly toward a raccoon. Raccoons are remarkably dexterous with their front paws and will reach through a gap in standard chicken wire, grab whatever is within reach and work at it from outside the enclosure without ever fully entering. This is one of the reasons standard hexagonal chicken wire genuinely is not adequate protection on its own. No matter how sturdy it looks from a distance, the gaps are simply wide enough for a raccoon's paw and forearm to pass through freely. Raccoons are also almost entirely nocturnal, so this pattern shows up overnight far more often than during daylight hours. Switching the lower 2 to 3 feet of any run fencing to welded hardware cloth with much smaller gaps removes this specific vulnerability directly. It costs more per foot than chicken wire, but it is the one upgrade that actually stops a raccoon from reaching through rather than merely slowing it down for a night or two. Raccoons are also genuinely skilled with latches and simple locking mechanisms, more so than most keepers expect the first time it happens. A basic slide bolt or a hook and eye latch is often not enough on its own. A carabiner clip or a padlock adds a step that a raccoon's paws, remarkably dexterous as they are, still cannot manage, and it is a cheap addition to any cope door or feed bin lid. The lower run fencing upgrade to hardware cloth typically costs somewhere between $40 and $80 for a modest run, depending on the total length of fence line you need to cover. It is worth doing this section first if your budget only allows one upgrade this season, since raccoons are among the most common and most persistent predator problems reported across this entire hobby. Number 4, several birds affected in a single visit. more than seems necessary for one meal. This pattern, unfortunately, points toward mink or weasel activity more than any other predator on this list. These animals hunt with an instinct that triggers repeatedly at rapid movement in an enclosed space, which means a single visit inside a coop can affect far more of the flock than a fox or a raccoon typically would in one night. The signature detail here is entry through a genuinely tiny gap. Weasels and mink can pass through openings smaller than a person's thumb, spaces that look completely harmless to the eye during a casual inspection. If a loss happens with no obvious entry point anywhere, recheck every seam, vent and joint in the coop itself for a gap this small before assuming the structure is sound. 1/2-inch hardware cloth, smaller than the standard 1-inch grade most coops are built. Width is the specific fix that closes this particular gap. It costs a little more, but is the only mesh size genuinely small enough to stop this specific predator. This particular predator is thankfully less common than the others on this list, but it is worth knowing the signature specifically because so many keepers assume a larger animal when the actual cause was something small enough to fit through a gap the size of a coin. Check vents, the space beneath doors, and any spot where two different building materials meet, since that seam is very often where a small gap goes unnoticed for months at a time. 1/2-inch hardware cloth for a full coop retrofit typically costs somewhere between $50 and $90 depending on the size of your structure, more than the other fixes on this list, but still a fraction of what repeated losses cost over even a single season. Number 5. A bird taken quietly with almost no disturbance and no obvious struggle at all. This quieter pattern often points to an opossum, particularly if it happens to a bird that was already unwell, very young, or roosting apart from the rest of the flock that night. Opossums are slow, largely opportunistic, and tend to target the easiest available option rather than actively hunting a healthy adult bird. The practical lesson here matters as much as the identification itself. A bird that is sick, injured, or simply isolated from the flock is at meaningfully higher risk from this kind of opportunistic predator, which is one more reason a nightly head count and a quick health check genuinely pays for itself over a season. If you catch an opossum still on the property, know that they move slowly and are easy to exclude going forward. Secure any gap at ground level and check that feed is not left out overnight, since an accessible food source is often what draws one onto the property to begin with. Opossums are also, worth knowing plainly, genuinely poor climbers compared to a raccoon and slow moving compared to a fox. A secure ground level perimeter and a feed bin with a proper lid handle this predator almost completely on their own without needing the more expensive upgrades that raccoons and foxes actually require. This is one of the more affordable problems on this entire list to solve properly once you know what you are dealing with. A simple, secure feed storage container, the kind with a locking or latching lid, typically costs somewhere between $20 and $40 and does double duty against several predators on this list at once, since an accessible feed source draws in far more than opossums alone across a full season. Here is what you can actually do the next morning if you find something has gone wrong overnight. Photograph the whole scene exactly as you found it before cleaning anything up at all, since details fade from memory fast, and a clear photo lets you compare against this list calmly rather than under real stress. Check the ground level perimeter first, then the run top, then every seam in the coop structure itself. Here is a simple weekly habit worth building regardless of whether you have had a problem recently. Walk the full perimeter once a week, specifically looking for disturbed ground. And check every wire seam and gap for anything that looks new since your last walk. A predator testing a fence usually leaves some small trace before it finally succeeds, and catching that trace early is far easier than reading the aftermath later. Keep a simple written log of anything unusual you notice on these weekly walks, even something as small as a slightly loosened staple or a patch of ground that looks freshly disturbed. Patterns that are invisible in any single week become obvious once you can look back across a month or two of the same notes side by side. And that pattern is often the difference between catching a problem before it happens and reading about it the hard way afterward. A trail camera aimed at the coop and run is one of the single most useful tools available for this exact problem. And prices have come down enough in recent years that a basic motion activated model now runs somewhere between $40 and $70. Rather than reading feathers and disturbed ground after the fact, a camera tells you directly and specifically which animal actually visited overnight, which turns every future guess on this list into a confirmed fact instead. If you are dealing with a repeated problem from the same predator, despite doing everything on this list, it is worth calling your local wildlife or extension office rather than continuing to guess at solutions alone. Many areas have specific, legal, humane guidance for persistent predator problems that goes beyond what any general video can responsibly cover, and a local expert knows exactly which predators are actually active in your specific area this season. I have put together a written predator identification guide with photographs of the specific signs covered here today, alongside a full checklist for securing a run against every animal on this list. It is linked below if today's video has you wanting the fuller version to keep on hand for reference. That woman from 2 winters back secured her run top within the very same week and has not had a single daytime incident since. Reading the scene correctly the first time around meant she fixed the actual gap rather than spending both money and effort on a fix that would never have addressed what really happened that particular night. Every predator on this list is beatable with the right specific fix in the right specific place, but only once you know which one you are actually dealing with. Guessing wastes money and leaves the real gap open. Reading the signs properly, the way we have just walked through together, tells you exactly where to spend your next hour of work, and that's worth far more than any amount of general worry ever was. Start tomorrow morning with a slow walk around the whole run before you do anything else with your day. Look up at the run top. Look down at the ground line and look closely at every seam where two materials meet. Most coops have at least one of these 5 gaps sitting open right now without their keeper ever having noticed it, simply because nothing has tested it yet. Find it before something else does, and you will spend far fewer mornings standing where that woman stood 2 winters back, looking at a scene you cannot yet properly explain, wondering where to even begin.